Now, Lieutenant Caffey is going to try and pull off a little magic act here. He's going to try a little misdirection. He's going to astonish you with stories of rituals and dazzle you with official-sounding terms like Code Red.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. At last count, Alec Baldwin has around half a dozen civil cases to deal with, and who knows what the director, Joel Souza, is going to do. Will there be a criminal case against him as well? A criminal case will give meat to the civil cases, and equally, if the Santa Fe DA decides the circumstances do not amount to criminal wrongdoing, one can imagine that may take a few teeth out of the civil claims. Although the Baldwin case seems straightforward, it really isn't. I don't think it's as simplistic as how did a live round get into the gun? And now we're seeing Baldwin's defense that he didn't pull the trigger may not be so simple or easy to debunk either. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So, kind of intuitively, when I was preparing for this episode, the well-known scene from A Few Good Men just kind of played in my mind, and I was just thinking of this idea of pulling off a magic trick. Almost the same as we saw in the O.J. Simpson case, where suddenly the gloves don't apply anymore. Suddenly, the most crucial evidence is the most ridiculous evidence. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And so you have the scenario where either he fired the gun or the gun fired itself. And so on that hinge, the whole case can really, to some extent, balance. Certainly, that is what is being speculated about. I'm not sure it's actually like that, but who knows, that might be a narrative that could convince a jury that it's either that the gun fired itself or that Baldwin fired the gun. Which one is it? And I think if they do reach the point where they reduce it to that question and that answer, that will be a victory for the defense case, for Baldwin. Now, according to Vanity Fair, quote, Baldwin made a bombshell claim in the interview with ABC News that when he said, "I didn't pull the trigger." And that actually caught the attention of DA Carmack Altwies. She said, "I didn't know too much about guns, certainly not about 1850s era revolvers. So when I first heard that, I was like, oh, that's crazy," she says. And that's the end of the quote. Well, it's not quite an 1850s era revolver, is it? It's 1880s Kansas, and that's my understanding. I know the story is set in 1880s Kansas, and one would think that the script would then call for a weapon from around the 1880s, not the 1850s. That's a 30-year age difference. So I think there is a difference. You know, you might say the armorer would just be expected to find some mid to late 19th century weapon. We don't know exactly what the date of that weapon, what it is. But I think it is going to be very crucial to a potential court case if there is a difference. In other words, if it's an earlier revolver or if it's a later revolver. I recently looked at the revolver that killed Vincent van Gogh, which is closer to the DA's production date. And you can see it's a lot closer to a pea shooter or water pistol than Russ Pieta, the long Colt 45 revolver. Now, some people have criticized me saying, why have you still not dealt with the mechanism? I actually have dealt with it in dribs and drabs here and there, and I guess I'm going to be dealing with it indirectly here. I have still meant to do a video dealing with it specifically, but in a way I sort of want to defer to people who actually have the revolver in their hands. And I recently saw Scott Reich from another true crime channel who has I think a $6,000 it's like an ancient vintage weapon demonstrating the anchoring mechanism, and he, I think, was expressing doubt on Alec Baldwin's version of events. I'll put a link to that in the description in case you haven't seen it. I do think it helps to see it demonstrated rather than someone just articulating what is going on. Now, as I say, I obviously don't know exactly what weapon the Santa Fe DA used in their experiment, but logically one can assume it was an older model than the Pieta, in other words, the actual weapon that Baldwin used. And if it was older, then it might have fewer engineering features, such as gears and locks. Just to put it in very simple terms, if you think about a vehicle that is current compared to a vehicle from 20, 30 years ago will have different features. There'll be more features in a modern vehicle. For example, I've got a vehicle, a Chrysler, that's 20 years old, and it's only the front passenger doors that have got power windows. The rear doors you've got to sort of manually crank them down. That's just a simple example. But I mean, the mechanisms, the machines become more efficient. We all know this. Think about a revolver in terms of a bicycle or a car. The further back you go in time, the more rudimentary they become. The further back you go in time, the fewer gears are built into the machine. Bicycles are a lot like that. Old bicycles sometimes only have 3 gears, sometimes only 1 gear. Now, I'm not a gun expert, but one would imagine the weapons made, with weapons made 30 years apart, there'd be a vast difference in their locking mechanisms as well as the effectiveness of these gears and anchors. Now, going back to that article in Vanity Fair, quote, Baldwin says that he merely pulled back the hammer of the gun. FBI analysis of the weapon will determine functionality as well as, and this is important, whether mechanical failures might have caused it to go off. And what they could have added there is by itself. But in the meantime, Carmack Altwies, that's the DA, and the investigative team did an unofficial test of their own. And so one of the investigators in her office, in the district attorney's office, happened to have a very old type revolver. So that's kind of a very broad description to say it's a very old type revolver. Well, exactly what kind of revolver was it? And so he brought it in at the DA's request so they could look at it and see if it was possible that it could sort of fire itself. And then this is what happened. Again, quoting from the article, quote, they cleared a room in the office and 2 investigators inspected the gun, the one who had supplied it, then a second officer who verified that it was empty. Then they visually showed me, the DA said. And then she says the following, you can pull the hammer back without actually pulling the trigger and without actually locking it. So you pull it back part way, it doesn't lock, and then if you let it go, the firing pin can hit the primer of the bullet. End quote. Now, what I think is quite interesting with that statement and with that demonstration is they're demonstrating the hammer kind of, what's the word, hitting the primer of the bullet, I guess. In other words, the hammer hammering down, if I can put it that way. But they obviously didn't use a real bullet, and that is really the ultimate test, is to put a real live round in it and see whether it will fire an actual bullet. I'm not sure if that's what they did. It doesn't sound like it. Anyway, I'm surprised the DA hasn't been more articulate and concise on exactly which revolver she was testing and its date of manufacturer. That's important. You've got to compare apples with apples. It sounds to me like they're comparing apples with oranges. I've seen around half a dozen demos now on YouTube, all showing this particular weapon, the Pieta, locking at very incremental intervals. And just from what I've seen, it really doesn't seem possible, this version where it fires itself, unless you have a very unlikely scenario of the mechanism failing. If the mechanism can be shown to be sturdy and not eroded or weathered or run down or worn down, then I don't know how you're going to be able to prove that case. Anyway, as I say, most recently Scott Reich did a demo with his own $6,000 vintage piece. Although the DA's test may be a game changer, if the model and age of the revolver is different to Baldwin's, it may not be. Nevertheless, we can see how the DA may be hesitant to bring charges. Just as in Boulder with the Ramsey case, you don't want to declare legal war on a multimillionaire and lose in court. The investigation and forensics report from the FBI is said to be complete by late February, which is realistically within the next week. Are we going to see that report? Well, the fact is, I think the DA's report is expected to take many months longer, unfortunately. I also think what's on Baldwin's phone and what's not will be a factor in the decision to potentially press charges. Are the number of civil cases to date any indication of the likelihood of criminal charges in this case? What do you think? So I'm not going to take it further than that. Just a heads up to the folks who are members of this channel. I'll be doing kind of an unscheduled episode, a live stream at about 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today. It'll be episode 5 in the Van Gogh series. And this episode also promises to be a really good one. So make sure you don't miss that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.